Now, I don't know how to get this nice and tight because, of course, anybody who wants more needs to listen to your podcast, A Moscow Shadow. And I want to ask this one because you infuse it throughout the book, but it's not the main point of the book. But what are the points that Putin keeps using wrongly from Russian history to try, and it doesn't even have to be Ukraine, for whatever he does? What are, one or two of the major points that he's constantly saying, this is how it happened, and history says, no, it didn't?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, again, we could spend another few hours on this, but I will try to avoid essentially foaming at the mouth and embarking on a rant on this, because it really does annoy me as a historian, as well as just simply as a human being, given that his misunderstandings of history also led him into this bloody war in Ukraine. I mean, obviously, as you mentioned, Ukraine, the very fact that he doesn't really believe Ukraine exists. He thinks Ukraine is a country that was created by Lenin, and he's actually said so. Well, of course, it's not. But okay, but if we're going to set that to one side, I think it's a much bigger overarching notion. Putin is determined to assert the fact that Russia is a great power. And when we don't treat Russia as he thinks a great power ought to be treated, he thinks that this is us being aggressive, us in the West being aggressive, and trying to sort of deny Russia its birthright. And the point is, he thinks Russia is a great power, not because of its GDP, which, let's be perfectly honest, is somewhere between that of Italy and Spain's, or because of its nuclear arsenal, how many times it can blow up the world. I've never quite understood why you want to blow it up more than once, but there you go. No, it's in some ways that its great power status is a birthright, because Russia's role has always been to sacrifice itself to save civilization. Now, one can kind of understand this when it's, for example, talking about the Second World War, because, yes, indeed, I mean, more than anything else, Hitler's forces were broken on the Eastern Front, although it's worth noting just how far Lend-Lease was absolutely crucial in that, and all that British and American equipment and food and so forth that was provided. Or, I suppose, if one can think about Napoleon, again, his catastrophic defeat, his retreat from Moscow. Now, again, in some ways, that the whole point is, by that point, his supply lines were already overextended, and anyway, his kind of pyramid scheme of an empire was already sort of beginning to fall apart. But it even goes back to the 14th century and the Mongols. I mean, the Mongols roared out of the east, just capturing, destroying everything in their path, believing that they had their own manifest destiny, that great blue sky Tengri, their sort of tutelar spirit, had basically said, take over the world, boys. And they took over the various principalities of the Rus without too much trouble. And then once they actually went further into Europe, that's when they began to falter, again, in part because of supply lines, in part because of the conditions didn't really suit their style of warfare so much. But more than anything else, because the great Khan back home had just died. And therefore, all the key princes were summoned back to a grand kurultai, a sort of grand assembly, to select the new one. So, without their generals and their princes, more or less the Mongols stopped. This has been reinvented in the new official Russian history as somehow that the resistance was such that it stopped the Mongols from going any further. So in effect, it's that sense of, we struggled with the Mongols to save you from them. I mean, I can continue with all sorts of other examples, but this idea that basically Russia has time and time again sacrificed itself to save civilization. And as a result, to put it bluntly, civilization owes Russia. That, I think, is incredibly pernicious, because it not only says that essentially Russia is entitled to some kind of special status over all its neighbors and such like, but it also means that anytime anyone challenges that, they're somehow spitting on generations, centuries of dead Russians who laid down their lives selflessly. And it helps give this kind of really I think I would say, sharp and vicious edge to Putin's propaganda and his understanding of his relationship with the West.